Welcome back right here at the World Conservation Forum. Our next topic, our next presentation is pretty fascinating. It's about what we miss, what we forget when we talk about climate change. This will be in English, so English speakers, please sit down and enjoy. The visiting fellow in the Danube Institute will be a presenter. His name is Calum Nicholson. Enjoy the presentation.
Hello. Good afternoon. Can you all hear me? Hello. So first of all, thank you for the invitation to speak here today. Is this also working? Good. All right, well, thank you very much for the invitation to come speak here today. It's a real pleasure to be here. And it's also good to be speaking at an event like this where the understanding of nature and the environment is not based on, it's good to be speaking at an event where the understanding of nature and the environment is not based on an exclusion of how we actually use nature and the environment. But I want to begin today with a story, which is going back to the 31st of May, 1970. And on the 31st of May, 1970 in Peru, an earthquake of 7.7 magnitude on the Richter scale hit central Peru, around the area of Arequipa. And this was famous and remains the most destructive earthquake that's happened in the Western Hemisphere ever since. It killed 70,000 people, and it left 500,000 homeless, and 160,000 buildings in the area were destroyed, which is 80% of the housing stock in that area of Peru. And what was very interesting about this earthquake was that whereas the earthquake itself lasted several minutes, there's actually an argument to be made, and has been made by the anthropologist Anthony Oliver Smith, that it was actually an earthquake that was 500 years in the making. So what did he mean by this? What he meant was that prior to Spanish colonialism, the Andeans who lived in that area of Peru had, over the course of centuries and millennia, established a form of culture that was adapted to a region which was susceptible to earthquakes. And what they'd done, for instance, is they'd established warehouses with supplies to use in the event of an earthquake. So warehouses that kept special supplies if they lost all their crops. They were also careful not to build in floodplains, particularly areas where the earthquakes were always strongest. Furthermore, when they did build, they didn't tie the walls together, or rather they did tie them, but they didn't set them together. So if an earthquake happened, the walls could move free. And they also did not use tiles, but they used thatch for the roofs, so that if the roofs collapsed, it would not hit people on the head. But this all began to change 500 years ago when the Spanish began to colonize in Peru. And what they did is they arrived and they replaced the building styles with Spanish architecture. So they wedded together the walls so they were rigid. And they also replaced the thatch with tiles, pan-tile roofs. They also began to build in floodplains. The city of Arequipa was built by the Spanish in a floodplain. And finally, they sold or used the warehouses of all the supplies of grain that were kept for a disaster, and they used this as taxation. And so actually in the 17th century, the town of Arequipa, built by the Spanish, was destroyed 4 times by earthquakes. And so what happened in the course of those hundreds of years is that a change in these building styles really left that community particularly susceptible to the big one, to a big earthquake. So during the 20th century then, the population of Peru had expanded dramatically. And so finally, when the big one came, the 7.7 magnitude earthquake in 1970, it killed untold numbers of people and was so destructive. Again, to this day, I think the most destructive natural disaster that's happened in the Western world. And Anthony Oliver Smith has written, in the last analysis, much of the devastation and misery caused by the earthquake was a product of historical processes set in motion at the time of the conquest. These processes ultimately subverted the generally effective adaptations of the many environmental hazards worked out by the people and cultures of the Andes over 10,000 years of human resilience in the region. Thus, the advanced vulnerability of the region is a socially created phenomenon, a historical product brought into being by identifiable forces. He said that Peru and other nations are therefore not empty vessels to be simply filled with Western technical information on hazard mitigation. They are existing cultures that were already adaptive until colonialism made them unadaptive. Now, the reason I mention this case is it perhaps illustrates the central and most important finding of an area of scholarship and research known as disaster risk reduction scholarship. And disaster risk reduction scholarship has one central tenet, one central finding or claim, which is extremely interesting. They basically argue that disasters are not natural, but rather social phenomena. That hazards, be they earthquakes or hurricanes or floods, may be natural, but the disasters themselves are social. And the example to illustrate this is, in fact, the one we've just shown, which is that earthquakes do not kill people. What kills people is collapsing buildings. Now, we'd think that such insights of disaster risk reduction scholarship would inform our view of climate change. After all, we, of course, care about climate change because of its presumed social consequence. And of course, earthquakes are themselves relatively clear-cut. They are limited in time and space to a particular place and a particular time, and they are quite easy to categorize and to measure, whereas climate change is relatively less clear-cut. It's, of course, when we talk of climate change, we often forget we're talking about aggregate data globally, and we're talking about a global statistical average over 30 years. When we talk of climate change, its definition is a rolling 30-year average. And of course, the effects of climate change are quite indirect, and they're hard to separate out from political economy. So for instance, if you ever see a hurricane, or if any natural hazard occurs, it's very hard actually to attribute that to climate change, because climate change is the average. Climate change is the signal, not the noise over a long period. And yet, despite what would seem to be the relevance of disaster risk reduction scholarship's finding, that disasters are social, not natural phenomena, which applies even to something as sudden as an earthquake, you'd think it applied to climate, how we understand climate change and its impact, but in fact it is barely acknowledged within the discussion of climate change, both by scholars but also in the public domain. In fact, I would argue that when climate change is discussed, an opposite assumption is often made. That is, that nature, rather than culture, is believed to determine our fate. Indeed, can fate be believed to be determined by climate change at all if we do not mitigate CO2, as if culture is a dynamic reaction to our environment, but instead a static consequence of it? Implied in this view of climate change is, in fact, a very interesting and I'd say inappropriate metaphor. And I think it's actually one that we can see as modeled on classical mechanics. So this is really interesting. If you think about how we think about climate change, often it's one that, it's a very mechanical model of seeing social outcomes. And I just want to go back, first of all, to remind us all of something we may all have learned in high school, which was Newton's classical laws of motion. So the first law of motion is, of course, that an object will not change its motion unless a force acts upon it. Now, often when we talk about climate change, there's a presumption that society will not change unless something like climate change acts upon it. The second law is that a change in momentum of an object will be directly proportional to the force applied to it. And this is very similar to how we think of climate's impact on society, because often when we talk about climate's impact on society, we presume that the effect on society will be proportional to the rate of climate change. And the third law of motion is that every action will be met by an equal and opposite reaction. And this is something that I think is, again, very evident in the climate concern. The very reason we talk about climate change is that we are concerned about how problematic its consequences will be. So I think it's important to note that when we talk about the societal impacts of climate change, this is what we're talking about. This is the background metaphor we're using when we're thinking about climate change's impact. There's a presumption that without climate change, society would remain the same, remain static. There's a presumption that the degree of climate change will dictate the degree of societal change. And there's a presumption that this change will be proportionally problematic in proportion to the amount of climate change there is. So this really is a sort of classical mechanical metaphor behind climate change. And I think actually it applies if we look at any particular way that we talk about the consequences of climate change. So a great example of this is when we discuss so-called climate migration. Now, when we talk about climate migration, it seems to be sort of an obvious case of a societal consequence of climate change. So migration is seen as a sort of obvious effect of climate change, and indeed climate change is seen as a sort of obvious cause of migration. And whatever your interests are, climate change or migration, both seem kind of obvious, in our heads anyway. And of course, this framing can be of interest, regardless of whether one's interest in migration is humanitarian, being concerned for the welfare of migrants, or about national security and a concern about too much migration. And we've all, of course, seen the pictures of climate migrants. If you Google it, you see pictures like this. You may have seen the figures that have been reported in the news, everything from 25 million to 1 billion so-called climate migrants. And we've also heard the labels. Often it's not just climate migrant, but it's climate-induced migration, or climate migrant to be, or environmental migrant, or climate refugee, or environmental refugee, or climate movement, or climate mobility, or climate displacement. There are all sorts of different terminology that's used to describe this so-called phenomenon. And yet, one of the interesting things in this is that despite all the pictures, and despite all the labels, and despite all the numbers that we see thrown around climate migration, actually, researchers themselves are not able to identify what they mean by climate migration and who is a climate migrant. And this is not just me saying this. Perhaps one of the most prominent papers published on this topic in the last few years was one in 2019 called Climate Migration Myths, which was published in the journal Nature Climate Change, perhaps the leading journal on climate change in a peer-reviewed context. This was notable because it was co-authored by 31 leading scholars on the topic of climate migration. But what was most interesting about this paper was that its premise, not its conclusion, but its premise, its starting point, was that we cannot talk about causality between climate and migration. And the reason was essentially because it's virtually impossible to separate out climate as a driver of migration from other more proximate factors, so social, political, economic factors. And so, as a consequence, it's not seen as an analytically useful basis on which you can fashion policy. But what's really interesting, if we look at the climate migration idea, we end up back at this sort of framing. Think about what climate migration means. It sort of presumes that if it wasn't for climate change, migrants would stay where they are, that they would be static. The first law. It secondly presumes that the rate of climate change will dictate the rate of migration, which is another flawed assumption, because actually a lot of the conditions under which people migrate are political, social, and economic, not to do with the climate. And the final assumption implied in the discussion of climate migration is that the amount of migration will be proportionally problematic and unwelcome wherever it arrives. This is a presumption at the outset that migration is inherently problematic. All three of these assumptions are, again, this sort of classical mechanical framing. And what I want to suggest is that this mechanical metaphor of these Newton's three laws, this underlying metaphor in how we talk about the topic, has always been inappropriate for understanding the societal impacts of climate change, migration not least, not only in its particulars, but also in its general spirit. The general problem is precisely that it is spiritless. It is a dead model that assumes that people are simply terrestrial bodies that we may categorize, model, and predict as we do celestial ones. It is a monistic framework that assumes that people are a unity, sharing a common outlook, compelled by the same desires and fears, and in receipt of the same facts, rather than a plurality with endlessly divergent mores, motives, and forms of meaning. As such, this mechanical metaphor is founded not simply on a misunderstanding, but I would argue an exclusion of everything that makes us human: the particular, the subjective, the contradictory, and the uncertain. To talk of so-called climate migration, and indeed any other of climate change's societal impacts, is always, and I'd argue inescapably, to talk from within this mechanical metaphor. For any such discussion always implies, in the end, a concern for causality, a causality we cannot prove. Herein lies the paradox of the literature and the discussion of climate migration and the social science of climate impacts in general. To speak coherently on the subject requires one to adopt this metaphor. But to adopt this metaphor is to retreat into an abstract realm bearing little relation to the real world and the lives of real people. Now, for at least a decade, this paradox has been something of an unwelcome elephant in the corner of any conference room where the societal impacts of climate change are discussed by scholars. While many researchers seem to recognize the existence of this paradox, few are willing to formally and publicly contemplate its full implications. And yet, the paradox is no less conspicuous for being ignored and constitutes, I think, the most profound and pressing issue facing research on this topic, regardless of whether research is empirical or legal, because it has vast implications, not just for what researchers and policymakers decide ought to be done, but also for what we decide can even be said about the very thing we are interested in, that is, the societal impacts of climate change. And we can extend this analysis a little if you like. So, for instance, when we hear about flooding, this is pictures of where I'm from in the UK, some flooding we had some years ago. Now, when we have flooding, we often hear in the news a discussion of it being caused by climate change. But what we often lack and fail to see is that flooding is a natural event, but also that what's changed in the last 50 years or 60 years is that populations have expanded and building regulations have changed, and many people who build new build sites of houses often then build them in floodplains. Now, one thing we often forget as well is that it tends to be these days that we all move quite often. On average, every American moves every 10 years, for instance. But this was not always the case. The reason that there are such things as local accents in most places, particularly in Europe, is that people have lived in the same area for hundreds of years through their families. This has all begun to change in the last few decades, but there used to be a deeper memory in the communities, that someone would remember, a farming community would remember the flood of 1800 because their family had been there since 1800. It's part of the memory. But when we move and the population cycles through, this memory is lost. So we don't remember there was a flood 70 years ago. And so then when we build, people say, well, there's no records of it, of there being a flood. But often the record would have been cultural, it would have been part of tradition. And this is how it is everywhere in the world. So often we think of these things as being a sign of climate change, but quite often it's simply that we have short memories. But we also have agendas. We want to make some money quickly. If you're in construction, it'll do. We'll build here in this floodplain. It looks dry enough. But maybe it won't be in a few years' time, as these people found out. And the same thing applies when we look at things like what happened in Syria. The droughts there were often attributed to climate change, but actually a lot of the context of the droughts were political and economic issues, which are far more complex. Also, an example, we can talk about the wildfires in California. We often, again, hear these attributed to climate change. But this somewhat neglects to notice that the insurance culture and insurance law in California means that people are not allowed to actually burn off any of the dead wood for fear of causing a fire. But if you do not burn off the dead wood, then the wood builds up and you have a massive fire. And that's often what's happening after many decades now of people not having any fires. Now you have these huge fires happening. The second reason, or the thing that's revealed when we look more closely, is again that houses are now built where they never used to be built because the population in California has expanded and people want a bit of the good life. They want to move out of the city and live in the forest. And the third is that a lot of the drought and dryness in California, again, is often attributed to climate change, is often largely because 80% of California's water goes to subsidized farms, particularly almond farmers, who actually contribute only 2% to California's economy. And so that's why it's so dry, which is leading to this perfect storm of events between people moving there, a changing insurance law and insurance culture in combination with the lack of water. But of course, it doesn't suit any of the political actors to have this pointed out. So it's very useful for everyone to say it's to do with climate change. So the broader point here that I'm trying to make is that science is, of course, important. But we forget, I think, we often forget that science is only half of the equation when we're talking about climate change. And indeed, often, when we talk of climate change, it therefore betrays, and the fact we focus on the science, betrays less a rich understanding of climate change, and I'd argue more an impoverished understanding of people and society. And I think there is some obvious analog here, indeed, to sort of illustrate my point when we talk about COVID-19 and lockdown. I don't think there's any denying that COVID is real, the epidemiology is good, the virology is very good. The science is very, very good on COVID. The problem is the question of what is a proportional lockdown policy is not a scientific question. It's a question of values and culture. It's a question of what is an acceptable risk to a society. And one culture may accept a different level of risk than another culture. That's kind of the reality of COVID-19, that we often think it's about objective science, but a lot of it is about subjective values. And when we say we are following the science, we are neglecting to have a real debate about what our values are. For instance, the question, is there more to life than the avoidance of death, for instance? I don't have any answers, but having that debate dispassionately is surely important for a civilized and healthy society. And the same applies to climate. The science of climate is quite good. The social science of climate is often quite close to astrology. A lot of it is very, very vague. It's not very rigorous. But in order to have a good understanding of climate change, we don't need to just understand the climate part of it, but also what we mean by society, which would be impacted by the climate. And of course, in the meantime, while we are discussing all these issues, of course, the climate narrative can, of course, be used and abused expediently by actors with their own agendas. You've all probably heard the phrase, the greening of the economy. Well, of course, there are many elements to this. One of them is that companies now engage in carbon trading, a practice that actually does very little to reduce emissions, but rather it has commodified emissions against the backdrop of the sentiment and the meaning that we now associate with emissions in the context of climate change. We've created a market without necessarily helping the climate. Another example is the boom for battery-powered cars. The background to this is people say that the consumption of fossil fuels is problematic, so we should turn to battery-powered cars. But there's not much evidence that the entire supply chain for battery-powered cars is ultimately any better for the climate. But one thing it does seem to do when we talk about battery-powered cars is it distances us from the smell of the petrol, the dirtiness of cars. In the same way how today we buy meat in Tesco's in vacuum-sealed packets. Now, 20 years ago, we would have gone to the butcher and seen the blood, and 150 years ago, we would have been hunting it ourselves. The animal is still killed, but we see less of it. We are less involved in the messy process. And in many ways, the battery-powered car phenomenon, I think, is less about the environment. It's more about an aesthetic. I don't want petrol on my fingers after I go to the gas station. Another example, of course, is wind farms, which have sprung up via government subsidy, scarring many landscapes, particularly in the UK. Where I grew up in the UK, we used to have a wonderful view of the Irish Sea. It now looks like we're being invaded by the tripods. There's thousands of wind farms out there. But little is said, of course, about wind farms, about the cost of the equipment, and indeed the efficiency, the inefficiency of the wind farms themselves. And of course, we all have spent time in hotels where they tell us to consider the environment and not use any water. But of course, this suits their economic bank balance too, because then they save money if you're not using the water. So, and I think also one last thing to say here on this is that when we talk about climate change and the culture around it, and I'm not even talking about the science here, I'm talking about the way that climate change has inculcated our broader culture and how we think. In some ways, to me, it often seems a bit like a millenarian movement. Because if you go back to the 11th century, in the 11th century, we often forget now, but if you read history of the 11th century, in the run-up to the year 1000 in Christian Europe, there was a great deal of concern that on the millennium of Christ's birth, that the world would end, that there would be this end of the world judgment day that would come. And when it didn't happen, then you saw in 1033, you had the same concern. The world would end on the anniversary of his death, the millennium of his death. And it's quite interesting if you look at Western society now, in secular culture particularly, is that there was the concern that everything was going to end with Y2K in the year 2000, the 2000-year anniversary. But what's really interesting now with the climate discussions is often the date that is suggested by which we have irreversible climate change is about 1030-something. It's basically the second millennium of Christ's death. Now, I don't think there's necessarily some sort of conspiracy in that, but I do think it's an interesting, it shows almost that there's potentially an interesting pattern in how we think that we may be doing without even thinking about it, because it's deeply built into the culture. But certainly, if you look around the culture right now, particularly with the climate issue, there is a certain millenarian sense to it. Millenarian in the sense that a belief that we live in a sinful world, that we must save it and establish the utopia. And that has happened throughout history. And it's always happened in history as well whenever communications technology changes. And of course, we've seen the communications technology change dramatically in the last few years with social media. And often in the wake of these changes, we see the emergence of these sorts of movements. And to say this is not at all to make a comment on the validity of the climate science. I think it's quite good. My point is about how we are engaging with that information as a culture, the sentiment and indeed the politics around it, the fact that things are divided into the so-called believers and the deniers and so on. It's become quite religious. So, to conclude, actually I'll just go back. When we hear talk of irreversible climate change by the 2030s, I think it's worth us considering not only what it explicitly claims about the climate, which is of course very interesting, but also what it implicitly suggests about society, about all of us, about ourselves. And here's some questions we need to ask ourselves. Does this narrative around irreversible climate change, does it give us at a cultural or indeed an individual level, rather than an institutional or government level, does it give us much credit, or does it show much confidence in our ability to adapt, to cope, to deal with the realities we're faced with? Second, does it show any awareness that people themselves may, through their collective memory, through their culture, know a few things about adaptation? And finally, does it not betray a view of society that conceives us all as rather passive and inanimate things rather than active and animate people? And I would argue it doesn't. It's a slightly paternalistic framing. We hear a lot these days about the need to develop climate adaptation measures. The solutions are often framed as technical, ideas produced by experts and scientists, by technocrats, by governments. But we forget, and this talk is titled, What We Often Forget When We Think About Climate Change. We forget that what we now call adaptation used to have another, more straightforward term or name, which is simply culture. Nature is itself a cultural idea, a set of norms and behaviors and routines, really traditions, formed over generations through sedimented experience over the centuries. This is what culture is. Culture is adaptation. It's the reason why in winter you dress for winter. It's the reason why the Swiss have different designed roofs than the British. This is adaptation. It's embedded in all of our cultures. The way each of you is dressed today is you looking at what the conditions are and dressing appropriately. That's what we do. That's how humans survive. We organize ourselves to survive. We have always been adaptive. So it's quite interesting that these technocratically framed narratives around climate change seem to often presume that no one's ever thought of adapting before. We've always been adaptive. And I think we must work to protect these traditions in the face of this new millenarianism, this new technocratic worldview, which I think the climate framing implies, which is, in its flawed mechanical metaphor, often serving quite cynical market-driven interests, I think is less this form of the climate framing is less really, I think, a solution potentially to any of our problems, but more, I think it's worth asking, is it part of the problem that we need to solve? Is the climate framing, the way it's being framed, part of the solution to our problems, or is it indeed part of the problem we need to solve, which is the problem of generality, the problem of grand theory, which actually is antithetical to, and indeed does some violence to, traditions and local culture, and the faith in people to actually adapt and to solve their own problems. Thank you very much.